I would just start by saying that if a prize was awarded today about the person in this room who knows the least about volcanoes, or better still, some research money, I would undoubtedly win it. I'm a historian of colonial Spanish America in the Department of Hispanic, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies. And I work on the centuries during which Spain gradually and over time conquered, colonized, and governed huge stretches of both North and South America. I put the map on the right there just to show just what a large part of North America Spain controlled during periods as well. So we're talking about the centuries from approximately 1500 to approximately 1825, though obviously this is gradual and over time that they came to occupy these areas, except for Cuba, for Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, which Spain retained until 1898. My own interests is in the 17th and 18th century, and specifically on the colonization of the frontier societies of Central and South America. And I'm interested in the impact of Spanish attempts at colonization on indigenous societies and cultures. So I have no background in science. I have not done any work at all up until very, very recently on natural hazard events in the colonial record, though I have come upon them on numerous occasions as I've worked my way through thousands of pages of old documents, but paid very little attention to them because they were not really relevant to what, to either the people or the processes that I was working on. So you might be asking, why am I here? Well, my participation really arises out of these two images, contemporary images of the Tungurahua eruption in Ecuador in April 1773. I sent them to Erica Hendy in Earth Sciences, a paleoclimatologist in Earth Sciences, with whom I was working on another project, which involved coral records that are contained within the building materials of the Spanish forts of Portobello in Panama. So I sent them not really anticipating that they would have any real value to a scientist, other than perhaps the impression that they convey from an eyewitness to this volcanic eruption and I'm just going to mark off a few things on these images because there are quite detailed descriptions here of what is being illustrated. For example, it showed the places that are marked 2 and 3 on this image. This is a cave here, that's high ground. According to the description, those were the places to which the people who fled from the eruption, or to which people fled as they tried to seek refuge from the eruption. The places marked 5 here are the plantations that were they were ruined almost in their entirety. This place here, marked 6, is the damming of the river. And just beyond it, marked 7, is the bridge that the rising river levels destroyed and cut off communications until a makeshift rope bridge was made and reconnected both sides. And this one, this one here again shows the damming of the river. And the description here indicates that, that this is not really precise or accurate measurement, but that this is intended solely to show the area that was covered by gravel and ash. And here I'll just show that is Mount Chimborazo, and that is Carihuayrazo. That's smoking there as well. So, much to my surprise, colleagues in Earth Sciences didn't think this was a quaint image of interest only to historians. but rather that it contained important scientific information and also important information about associated impacts and hazards after a major volcanic eruption. So, apart from Erica, Kathy Cashman, Alison Rust, and I came together to talk about the possibilities of the Spanish archival record, not least because of the area that it covers, for throwing new light on questions that are critical to current work on natural hazard events, not only volcanic eruptions, but also earthquakes, hurricanes, droughts and floods, and so on. So we've done two things. We'll just say something very briefly first about the enormous challenges that this poses for us. On the one hand, of course, it's the an intellectual challenge because the big questions, if you like, in science do not overlap with those in history. There are not hundreds of people mining the record for evidence of natural disasters in the colonial period amongst historians. So that's one challenge, but the other is the sheer size of the colonial record. The Spanish established a very complex and extensive system of secular and religious administration that generated many tens of thousands of written documents in Spain alone. That is not counting all the national, regional, local, and parish records that exist in Spanish America for the same period. So the real question for us as we started to think about this collaboration was really to attempt a pilot study, which, thanks to the funding of the Cabot Institute, the research for that has just come to an end. Shakia Stewart, one of our own MA students from Bristol, has been in Seville carrying out research on the records for Cuba and for Puerto Rico for the 3 years before and the 3 years after the Tambora eruption. So the idea really, the aim is to assess whether a systematic search through a selected number of documents will enable us to answer questions about what the impact of that eruption was on the Spanish Caribbean. Well, I'll go back to volcanoes now and earthquakes. We don't yet have the data that Shakia has collected. So what I want to do for the rest of this talk is simply to draw out from 4 documents that I have located on volcanic and earthquake events, some of the information that can be extracted from them, just to show, to sort of pose this as a question, how valuable is this information to current-day scientists, and also what challenges do they pose. And I'm going to be quoting or showing some quotations from these, but of course we have to think about questions of accuracy, reliability, corroboration, the fact that these were documents that were written before there were proper measuring instruments. They often reflect the shock of the immediate event. So, is there exaggeration built in? So all these questions, but nonetheless, I think they do tell us quite a lot that's interesting. So, the 4 documents, this is the first one. This is a 4-page account of the eruption of Chimborazo in 1698 that, according to this report, occurred exactly at the same time as an earthquake in Ecuador. The second one is the account of the Tungurahua eruption. This is one of the documents that accompany the images that I've just shown. The third is a report from the governor of the Quito region, the whole of the Quito region, who's talking about the condition of the district under his command after an earthquake in 1797. And there are also indications that this earthquake coincided with a volcanic eruption, though at the time of writing it wasn't really clear which of the volcanoes had erupted. There was talk that it was Tungurahua. There was talk also possibly what they call Macas, which I think is Sangay, and El Altar and Igualata were also mentioned as possible eruptions at the time. And then this one, which is probably the most interesting of all of them, it's a 36-page, as you can see, densely printed. The fact that it was printed itself indicates the importance that was attached to it. Account of the events that occurred in the city of Guatemala from 27th of August, 1717, when the Fuego volcano erupted. And it goes through that whole month and up until the 29th of September, when then there was a massive earthquake which destroyed the city. And it goes on, it says, you know, in the title it says until the 16th of October, but actually it goes on to the 28th of October. All right, so the kinds of things that come out of it. Obviously, the precise dating and timing. This always, in all these documents, we have absolutely precise timings for these events. Between 1 and 2 in the morning, often the sort of precise timing, I'll just say before I go on, is to do with the fact that they then go on to explain how many people were killed and how they were buried in the ruins of their own houses or under their beds and so on. So the fact that if it's at night, for example, the damage would be much worse. So between 1 and 2 in the morning of 20 June, the earth began to shudder, and at exactly the same time as the tremors began, Mount Chimborazo and another nearby volcano both erupted, expelling vast torrents of water mixed with mud, which flooded the fields and led the Ambato and other rivers to break their banks. In the 1773 Tungurahua eruption, between 4 and 5 on the afternoon of 23 April, the volcano erupted, having given no prior signs to indicate the devastation that it would wreak. And it goes on to talk about tremendous roaring, vomiting fire, sparks, sand, mud, ash, water, and dense smoke that covered the atmosphere. Interestingly, I'm sure my scientist colleagues will tell me whether this is possible or not, new openings appeared in the mountain during this eruption through which the volcano spewed the same substances as the main one. But the documents also tell us about the worst affected areas. The 1779 earthquake, for example, all places in the vicinity of Tungurahua have suffered the most. It talks about the cracks opened by the earthquake being so enormous that they swallowed up entire farms. Pieces of the mountain falling off, halting the course of the river Patate, the waters of which overflowed and flooded everything they found in their path. The documents often tell us about the severity and extent of the damage. Again, you know, vast quantities of water. This is from 1698. The river overflowing and destroying all plantations, mills, farms, houses, and livestock. It tells us exactly where the tremors were felt at, the same time in every place between Chimbo and the village of San Miguel. Many people of both sexes and all classes died as most were asleep. There we go, the timing is important here. When the earthquake struck in the town of Patate, 4 leagues distance from Ambato, more than 200 people were killed. And again, these may well have been older people because they didn't run fast enough and they were caught and drowned. So nothing is left of this town. And in Latacunga, most residents also asleep were buried under their beds and houses, and others choking on the dust as they tried to escape. Sometimes they contain references to earlier events in 1698, or actually events that are occurring, they have heard to be occurring in other places at around the same time. So in 1698, a letter from Popayan was quoted, dated the 10th of September, so a few months after Chimborazo erupted, reporting that 2 nights before, a great crashing sound was heard, and that it is feared that one of the volcanoes of Pasto has erupted. And it goes on to say, which have for some time, so more than one, had been roaring and emitting flames and smoke. In Tungurahua, it talks about formidable damage having been caused from a mouth close to its peak in the years 1640 and 1645, and talks about the volcano having remained quiet for 128 years, although it did emit smoke from time to time. So again, there's a couple of others. I'll just pass those because I'll come back to the Guatemala one in a minute. So you get information about the social effects and impacts and the fear that was caused by these eruptions, and that comes through the documents very, very strongly. In 1698, we were all so startled by the daily tremors that people are living in the fields and also fleeing the decaying dead bodies, there having not been opportunity in the fear and confusion to bury them, and most of the survivors suffering injury to their legs, arms, and heads. They also tell us about other possible impacts and effects. 1797, the document talks about the fact that they had to intervene to prevent price rises because there were food shortages, and obviously some people were taking advantage of that and raising the price of the food that was available. Health hazards, the fetid stench emanating from the ruins in the various towns due to the dead bodies, not just of men, but also of animals that were buried underneath them. Potential for unrest, that is also detected amongst officials. This is not meant to be read literally, by the way. Spaniards were always worrying about Indian discontent and possible rebellion. But I am vigilantly watching the behavior of the Indian inhabitants, whom local officials inform me have become insolent, arguing that they should no longer pay tributes to the crown. Clearly, they too had been badly affected, and the thought that they would have to pay tributes to the crown was something that was worth protesting about at the time. And I'm going to end with just a few slides, because I think the one thing these old documents do show very strongly is the human dimension, how people experienced a major eruption or an earthquake, how they described those experiences, how they responded, and as we'll see in a minute, there's a short-term response and then there's a longer-term response. How did they explain them? Was this about the wrath of God? Was this just an all-powerful nature that man had no ability to control? So, this is from the anonymous account of the 1717 Guatemala eruption, so this is the end of August. And those first few days, the account talks about the voracious and furious flames, horrible spectacle produced by the volcano. It talks about the enemy volcano, the sky covered by dense and dark clouds, an obelisk of smoke, and yet, in the midst of fear and confusion, it was impossible not to admire the extraordinary nature of those effects. By the 30th, 3 days later, it talks about one of the most peculiar and unusual effects beginning on that day. A subterranean sound accompanied by so violent a shaking of the earth, and it talks about the effects, the feeling of it being analogous to that created in the cabin of a ship when a cannon was fired. And these echoes and tremors that went on for a very long time, and says on one day more than 50 were counted, some lasting as long as it takes, remember this is Spanish America, to recite a Hail Mary. And having been brought up in Argentina and having done this myself right through my childhood, I can tell you it takes 14 seconds. So, the earthquake of the 29th of September that moves on talks about it beginning with a violent tremor at 7 p.m., followed by another equally horrendous, and then the massive earthquake. Talks about it being all the more singular by the vertical, I'll manage, vertical nature of the movement, such that no person was able to remain upright. Even people who were kneeling were thrown to the ground and shaken violently. The horror of the dust cloud that came from the buildings, the confusion of voices on seeing the sky, I love this line, covered by clouds so dense and black that it appeared as though the firmament had been plunged into mourning. Okay, responses. This is my the last slide that I'll talk about. I've split these because these are the sort of ones on the left are the immediate responses. prayers and novenas, religious processions, mass absolutions, people who hadn't been to church for years, it says, in the document, people who were, hadn't had anything to do with the church, suddenly seek confession in the belief that they are to die. Rumor spread very rapidly about premonitions that people had had, about revelations about the day of judgment being upon Guatemala City, and that the day that the end of the world was going to come was the 4th of October, which is only 6 days after the massive earthquake, so it's no surprise, really, that people were so fearful. But then the document talks about people feeling as though they had been risen from the dead when the 4th of October passed without incident. But I think what I find really interesting about this document, though, is that within 2 weeks after the shock and horror had passed, and the need to come to terms with the destroyed city was acknowledged, citywide debates start to take place. And remember, this is 1717. Do we relocate or do we rebuild? The city was totally destroyed. And out of those debates and discussions, comparisons appear, for some people saying, well, the people in Catania live there and there's Etna, and they haven't moved. And the same about the Canaries, the Azores, they mentioned Vesuvius. So for those people who say, they didn't move and they've got volcanoes, their argument is that relocation would mean they'd have to leave the city that had been occupied for 176 years. And that would mean enormous economic loss, but also famine, fatigue, all the labors that would be required to start anew, and the potential of disease. Yeah. For others, the certainty of future disaster, and here is the mention, this city has been destroyed 9 times in 176 years. Going back to the Agua volcano in 1541, and making the comparison about Catania and Etna, that Guatemala City had 4 nearby volcanoes, and that made the situation entirely different. And that, shifting again now, leaving religion behind and saying prudence dictates that we leave. We cannot expect to be saved by miracles here, and it's time to go. And then cost-benefit analysis, I'll say nothing there, it's just there. But just to say, of course, the city was not moved. It was not relocated until after the next massive earthquake of 1773. So I'm just going to leave this up there if anybody wants to read it. Some very nice language that gives some insight into how enormous these events seemed to people, that there were no words that could express the feeling of being present at one of these events.